Imagine standing at the edge of a river. The water is still. The air is thick and humid, heavy with the smell of rotting vegetation and tropical heat. Somewhere in the tree line behind you, a herd of large dinosaurs moves through the undergrowth. You can hear them, the low rumble of their footsteps, the crack of branches, the occasional bellow echoing through the floodplain. Now look at the river. Something is wrong with the surface. There is a shape near the bank, long, impossibly long. You tell yourself it is a log, a fallen tree half submerged, drifting slowly with the current. But logs do not have eyes, and logs do not wait. What you are looking at is 12 meters of living predator. A crocodilian so massive it makes the saltwater crocodile, the largest reptile alive on Earth today, look like a garden lizard. It weighs more than 8 metric tons. Its skull alone is over 1.5 meters long. Its teeth are not the thin, needle-like fangs of a fish eater. They are thick, blunt, rounded at the tip, built not to pierce, but to crush, to grip, to hold something enormous underwater and never let go. This animal is not a dinosaur. It is not a marine reptile. It is not a monster from science fiction. It is Deinosuchus, and for nearly 10 million years, it was the most feared ambush predator in North America. The name means terrible crocodile, and for once, a prehistoric name does not disappoint. We are going back 80 million years, to a world that looks nothing like the one we know, to a continent split in half by a shallow inland sea, to river deltas and coastal swamps where the boundary between land and water was never truly safe, to an ecosystem where even large theropod dinosaurs, animals that weighed several tons and stood taller than a modern elephant, had reason to be afraid of the water's edge. This is the story of Deinosuchus, how it lived, how it hunted, what it actually was, and why, for decades, paleontologists could barely believe the bones they were pulling out of the ground. Because when the first fragments were discovered in the late 1800s, scientists assumed they belonged to some kind of unknown giant turtle. The teeth were that strange, that thick, that unlike anything they had seen before in a crocodilian. It took over a century of new discoveries, new technology, and new analytical methods to finally understand what Deinosuchus really was and what it was capable of. And the answer, when it finally came together, was more extraordinary than anyone had predicted. So stay with me, because we are only just beginning. To understand Deinosuchus, you first have to understand the world it lived in, because the North America of 80 million years ago was not North America as we know it. It was something stranger, something almost unrecognizable. Forget the Rocky Mountains, forget the Great Plains, forget the Mississippi River and the vast, connected landmass stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic. None of that existed yet. Instead, picture a continent that had been sliced in half, cleanly, dramatically, from north to south, by a shallow interior sea. Paleontologists call it the Western Interior Seaway, and at its peak, it stretched over 3,000 kilometers from what is now the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to the Arctic Ocean, dividing the North American continent into two separate land masses. The eastern portion was called Appalachia. The western portion was called Laramidia, and it was on Laramidia, along its warm, low-lying coastal plains and river deltas, that Deinosuchus made its home. This was the Late Cretaceous period, approximately 82 to 75 million years ago. The climate was dramatically warmer than today. There were no polar ice caps. Sea levels were far higher. The average global temperature was somewhere between 6 and 12 degrees Celsius warmer than our modern baseline, and the coastlines of Laramidia were dominated by vast subtropical and tropical environments. Dense floodplain forests, enormous river systems, swampy deltas, and shallow coastal lagoons fed by warm seawater from the interior sea. This was not a quiet landscape. This was one of the most biologically productive and ecologically complex environments in the history of the Mesozoic era. The vegetation was transforming. Flowering plants, angiosperms, had only recently begun their spread across the planet, and they were already reshaping entire ecosystems. Forests of magnolias, figs, and early relatives of modern palms competed with older conifer and fern communities. The floodplains were green and dense and layered with life at every level, and the animals that lived here were extraordinary. Laramidia was home to some of the most iconic dinosaurs in the fossil record. Hadrosaurs, the so-called duck-billed dinosaurs, were everywhere. Animals like Griposaurus and Cretaceous moved in enormous herds across the coastal plains, grazing on low vegetation, their flat, grinding teeth processing hundreds of kilograms of plant material every day. Some of these animals were 7 to 9 meters long and weighed 4 to 5 metric tons. They were among the most successful herbivores the world had ever seen. Ceratopsians were also present, the horned dinosaurs, relatives of the later and more famous Triceratops. Albertoceratops and its kin moved through the same floodplains, their massive frilled skulls and forward-pointing horns making them formidable animals despite their herbivorous diet. And then there were the predators. Large theropod dinosaurs patrolled Laramidia in numbers. Tyrannosaurids, the relatives of the later Tyrannosaurus rex, were already well established. Animals like Beastoheversor and early members of the Tyrannosaur lineage were apex predators of the inland environments. Smaller but fast and agile dromaeosaurids hunted in the undergrowth. Giant ornithomimosaurs, ostrich-like dinosaurs nearly 5 meters long, moved at high speed across open ground. This was a world full of large, powerful, well-adapted animals. Animals that were, by any measure, extremely dangerous. And yet, along the rivers, in the brackish lagoons where freshwater met the sea, in the wide, slow-moving delta channels lined with ancient cypress-like trees and dense reed banks, something waited that even the largest dinosaurs had reason to fear. The coastal waterways of Laramidia were the domain of Deinosuchus, and understanding why requires understanding just how different this animal was from the crocodilians we know today. Modern crocodilians are often described as living fossils, and in some ways, that description is accurate. Their basic body plan has remained remarkably stable for tens of millions of years. Long body, sprawling limbs, powerful tail, armored back, jaws designed for gripping and drowning. The fundamental architecture works. Evolution has not seen a compelling reason to dramatically alter it. But size is not fixed, and Deinosuchus took the crocodilian body plan and scaled it up to a degree that still staggers paleontologists today. The most complete material we have comes from multiple sites across what is now the American Southwest and Southeast. Fossil-bearing deposits in Texas, specifically the Aguja Formation in the Big Bend region, have produced some of the most significant Deinosuchus material known to science. Additional remains have been recovered from formations in Montana, Wyoming, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and New Jersey. The geographic spread of these finds tells us something important. Deinosuchus was not a rare, isolated creature occupying a narrow ecological niche. It was widespread, successful, present across enormous stretches of the Laramidian coastline for millions of years. The species known from the western material, recovered primarily from Texas and surrounding regions, has been named Deinosuchus riograndensis.
A second species from the eastern Appalachian landmass, known primarily from material in Georgia and Alabama, has been named Deinosuchus schwimmeri. And a third, more recently described species from the north of Laramidia has been named Deinosuchus hatcheri. These are not simply geographic variants of the same animal. Recent phylogenetic analysis, including work published in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology in 2020, suggests they represent genuinely distinct species, animals that had been separated long enough by the interior seaway to diverge into different lineages. But regardless of species, the basic dimensions are extraordinary. The skull of Deinosuchus riograndensis has been estimated at approximately 1.5 meters in length. To put that in perspective, the skull of a large modern saltwater crocodile, the largest living reptile on Earth, maxes out at around 70 centimeters. The skull of Deinosuchus was more than twice as long, and proportionally, it was heavier, wider, and more massively built. Total body length estimates have varied considerably over the decades as new material has come to light and analytical methods have improved. Early estimates placed Deinosuchus at around 15 meters. More conservative modern analyses, working from the best available skeletal material and scaling from the skull dimensions, suggest a total length of approximately 10 to 12 meters for the largest individuals. That is still enormous. That is longer than a city bus. That is longer than a Tyrannosaurus rex. And the mass estimates, which are notoriously difficult to calculate for extinct animals, suggest a body weight somewhere between 5 and 8 metric tons for fully grown adults.
But perhaps the most revealing feature of Deinosuchus is not its size. It is its teeth. Because the teeth of Deinosuchus are deeply, profoundly strange, and they are the key to understanding almost everything about how this animal lived and what it was capable of. Pick up a fossil tooth of Deinosuchus and hold it in your hand. If you have never seen one before, your first instinct might be to question what animal it actually came from, because it does not look like a crocodile tooth, not at first, not even close. Modern crocodilian teeth are conical, pointed, designed for puncturing and gripping. They are weapons built for seizing prey and holding it underwater while the animal drowns. They are not designed for crushing, not designed for processing bone. They are fish catchers, flesh piercers, grip and twist tools for the death roll. The teeth of Deinosuchus are something else entirely. They are thick, massively thick, almost cylindrical in cross-section rather than truly conical. The tips are rounded and blunt rather than sharply pointed. The enamel surface is heavily ridged with a texture that paleontologists describe as rugose. Rough, almost corrugated, reinforced in a way that speaks directly to the extreme mechanical stresses these teeth were designed to absorb. And they are large. The largest recovered teeth from adult specimens reach approximately 12 centimeters in length. That is longer than your hand from wrist to fingertip. These are not fish-catching teeth. These are bone-crushing teeth. And that single anatomical observation, that one detail visible to anyone who holds a Deinosuchus tooth and compares it to the tooth of a modern Nile crocodile, tells us something fundamental about this animal's ecological role, something that took paleontologists a surprisingly long time to fully accept. Deinosuchus was not primarily a fish eater. It was not an opportunistic scavenger picking at carcasses along riverbanks. It was an active predator of large prey. Very large prey. Prey measured not in kilograms, but in metric tons. The evidence for this comes from multiple independent lines of investigation, and each one on its own is compelling. Together, they build a picture that is almost impossible to argue with. The first line of evidence is biomechanical. Researchers studying the skull morphology of Deinosuchus have used computational modeling to estimate the bite force this animal was capable of generating. The architecture of the skull, the depth of the snout, the robustness of the jawbones, the positioning and size of the jaw-closing musculature, the reinforcement of the palate, all point to an animal capable of generating bite forces that exceed those of virtually any other terrestrial or semi-aquatic predator in the fossil record. For comparison, the bite force of a large modern saltwater crocodile has been measured at approximately 16,000 newtons. That is already extraordinary. It is among the highest bite forces ever recorded in a living animal. Now consider that bite force scales roughly with body mass, and that Deinosuchus was potentially 4 to 5 times heavier than the largest living saltwater crocodile. The numbers become almost difficult to process. Conservative estimates suggest Deinosuchus was capable of generating bite forces in the range of 100,000 newtons or higher. That is enough force to crush the femur of a large hadrosaur, to penetrate the osteoderms, the bony armor plates, embedded in the skin of another large reptile, to hold, compress, and ultimately kill an animal weighing several metric tons. The second line of evidence is direct, and it is the kind of evidence that makes paleontologists stop and stare. In 2002, a research team led by David Schwimmer, the same paleontologist after whom Deinosuchus schwimmeri was named, published an analysis of bones from hadrosaur dinosaurs recovered from the same formations that yield Deinosuchus fossils, specifically from the Aguja Formation in Texas and from deposits in the southeastern United States. And on those hadrosaur bones, on the limb bones, the tail vertebrae, the pelvic elements, they found bite marks. Not just any bite marks. Bite marks that matched the tooth dimensions and spacing of Deinosuchus precisely. The marks were deep. Some penetrated entirely through the cortical bone of large limb elements. The spacing between individual tooth marks corresponded to the known tooth spacing in Deinosuchus jaws. And critically, some of the marks showed signs of healing. The bone had begun to remodel around the wound after the attack, which means the hadrosaur survived at least the initial encounter. It escaped. It lived long enough for its skeleton to begin repairing the damage, and it still carried the marks of Deinosuchus teeth in its bones. Think about what that means for a moment. A hadrosaur weighing perhaps 3 to 4 metric tons, an animal the size of a large rhinoceros, built solidly, capable of moving at considerable speed, had been seized by Deinosuchus and had somehow broken free. The attack was violent enough to punch through dense bone, and yet the dinosaur survived. Which tells us two things simultaneously. First, that Deinosuchus absolutely and without question attacked large dinosaurs as prey. And second, that even Deinosuchus, with its extraordinary bite force and enormous body, was not guaranteed a kill every time it struck. The hunt was not always successful. The prey sometimes fought back, and occasionally it escaped. But there is a third line of evidence, one that researchers only began to fully appreciate after more complete skull material became available in the early 2000s. Look at the skull of Deinosuchus from above. Not from the side, from directly above. And notice the shape of the snout. Modern crocodilians have snouts that taper toward the front. In gavials and gharials, the most specialized fish eaters, this taper is extreme, producing a long, narrow, almost needle-like rostrum. In broader snouted species like the American alligator, the The snout is still clearly tapered, wider at the base and narrowing toward the tip. This shape is consistent with an ambush predator that seizes prey from the side and holds it, the long axis of the jaws sweeping horizontally through the water to intercept fish or grab a drinking animal by the leg. The snout of Deinosuchus is different. It is wide, remarkably wide relative to its length. The proportions are almost more reminiscent of a sperm whale's jaw than a typical crocodilian. This wide, robust rostrum would have dramatically increased the surface area available for jaw musculature attachment, contributing directly to that extraordinary bite force. But it also tells us something about how the animal struck. A wide, robust snout is not optimized for lateral sweeping. It is optimized for a direct, powerful downward bite. A strike delivered from above, from ambush, from the surface of the water onto something large and solid directly in front of the animal. Picture it. A hadrosaur herd at a river crossing. The water is shallow, perhaps a meter deep at most. The animals wade through cautiously because experience has taught them, in the way that only predation pressure across thousands of generations can teach a prey species, that water means danger. And then, from beneath the surface, something erupts upward with a speed that seems physically impossible for an animal of that size. Because here is something that the popular image of Deinosuchus tends to get wrong. The assumption is that enormous size means slowness, sluggishness, a giant ambush predator that relies purely on patience and power rather than explosive speed. But crocodilians are not slow, not in the strike. Modern crocodiles can lunge from the water and cover the last meter or two of an attack in a burst that lasts fractions of a second. The initial strike of a large Nile crocodile has been measured at speeds that rival the strike speed of many snakes. And Deinosuchus, built along the same fundamental lines but scaled dramatically upward, would have retained much of that explosive capability, at least for the brief, violent moment of the initial lunge. The prey had almost no warning. The strike came from below and in front. The jaws closed on a leg, a tail, a neck. And then the real power of Deinosuchus came into play. Not speed, but mass. Sheer, overwhelming, inescapable mass. The death roll, the sustained grip, the weight of 8 metric tons pulling a struggling dinosaur sideways and then downward into water it could not breathe. This was not a chase predator. This was not an animal that pursued prey across open ground. Deinosuchus was the ultimate ambush specialist, patient beyond anything we can easily imagine, capable of remaining motionless in shallow water for hours, indistinguishable from a distance from a submerged log or a dark shape in murky water. And then, in a single explosive moment, the most dangerous animal on the Laramidian coastline. But knowing how Deinosuchus hunted only raises deeper questions. Questions about its biology, about how an animal this large actually grew and functioned, about how long it lived, and about one particular feature of its anatomy that paleontologists did not even know existed until relatively recently. A feature that, when it was finally described in the scientific literature, genuinely surprised the entire field. Growth. It is one of the most fundamental questions in paleontology, and for an animal as extreme as Deinosuchus, it is also one of the most revealing. How does something get this big? The question sounds simple. But the answer, when paleontologists finally began to piece it together, turned out to be one of the most fascinating aspects of Deinosuchus biology. Because the way this animal grew was not what anyone expected, and it tells us something profound about the investment of time and energy required to produce a predator of this magnitude. The key to understanding growth rates in extinct animals lies inside the bone itself, not on the surface, not in the shape or the proportions, inside, in the microscopic structure of the bone tissue, a field of study called paleohistology. When you cut a cross-section through the limb bone of a vertebrate animal and examine it under a microscope, you see growth rings. Rings laid down annually, like the rings inside a tree trunk. Each ring represents 1 year of life. The spacing between rings tells you how fast the animal was growing in any given year. The total number of rings tells you the minimum age of the individual at death. In the mid-2000s, researchers began applying this technique to Deinosuchus bone material, and the results were striking. Deinosuchus grew slowly, remarkably slowly, even by the standards of large crocodilians, which are themselves not fast growers. The bone histology suggests that Deinosuchus reached its full adult size only after approximately 35 to 40 years of continuous growth. To put that in perspective, a modern saltwater crocodile, the largest living reptile, reaches sexual maturity at around 16 years and achieves maximum size somewhere between 30 and 40 years. And the saltwater crocodile maxes out at around 6 meters and just over 1 metric ton. Deinosuchus needed a similar investment of time to reach a body mass 8 to 10 times greater. This tells us something important about the population dynamics of this animal. Fully grown adult Deinosuchus, the individuals capable of tackling the largest dinosaur prey, were not common. They represented decades of survival, decades of successful hunting, avoiding injury, weathering droughts and floods and the ecological pressures of a competitive Cretaceous coastline. Every massive adult Deinosuchus you might have encountered along the shores of the Western Interior Seaway was, in a very real sense, a survivor, an animal that had already outlasted the vast majority of its own kind. Juveniles, of course, were a different matter entirely. Young Deinosuchus were small. Hatchlings emerging from the nest would have measured perhaps 30 to 40 centimeters, fragile, vulnerable, and in constant danger from the very predators that their parents were capable of killing with ease. Large theropod dinosaurs almost certainly preyed on juvenile Deinosuchus. Larger fish, giant turtles, even other crocodilians may have posed threats to animals in their first few years of life. The mortality rate among juveniles was almost certainly very high. Most individuals never made it past the first decade. But those that survived, those that crossed the threshold from vulnerable juvenile to subadult to fully grown adult, became something almost unkillable in their ecological environment. There was nothing on the Laramidian coastline capable of reliably killing a fully grown Deinosuchus. No theropod dinosaur, not even the largest tyrannosaurids of that time and place, would have found it straightforward to attack and kill an 8 metric ton armored crocodilian in or near the water. The adult Deinosuchus was, in its chosen habitat, essentially without predatory competition. Now, the feature I mentioned at the end of the last chapter, the anatomical detail that caught paleontologists genuinely off guard. It has to do with the nose. More specifically, with a structure on the top of the snout, a large, distinctive boss of rugose, roughened bone located just in front of the eyes on the dorsal surface of the skull. This feature is visible in well-preserved Deinosuchus skull material and was noted by researchers for years without a fully satisfying explanation. It is not a horn. It is not a weapon. It is not an attachment point for any known muscle group that would have contributed to the bite. So what was it? In 2020, a research team led by Adam Cossette and Christopher Brochu published a comprehensive redescription of Deinosuchus in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology. the most thorough analysis of the genus since its original description over a century earlier. And in that paper, they addressed the nasal boss directly. Their conclusion was careful and appropriately hedged, as good science demands. But the most compelling hypothesis they advanced was that this structure served a display function, a visual signal, a marker of individual identity, reproductive status, or dominance within the population. Modern crocodilians use a variety of visual and acoustic signals for communication, particularly during mating season and territorial encounters. Male saltwater crocodiles perform elaborate head slap displays on the water surface. Alligators produce infrasonic vibrations that cause the water above them to literally dance in visible ripples. Visual features on the skull, coloration, scale patterns, prominent ridges, play a role in individual recognition and social signaling across many crocodilian species. The nasal boss of Deinosuchus, prominent and positioned at the very front of the visible skull profile when the animal lay at the water surface, would have been clearly visible to any individual approaching from the front or the side. Its rugose texture suggests it may have supported a keratinous covering, a layer of hard protein tissue similar to horn, which does not preserve in fossils, but which would have made the structure even more visually prominent in life.
This means that Deinosuchus was not simply a killing machine operating in ecological isolation. It was a socially aware animal, an individual capable of recognizing others of its kind, of assessing rivals, of signaling its own status and condition, of competing for mates and territory not only through brute force, but through visual display and communication. And territory matters enormously here, because Deinosuchus did not share the coastline equally or peacefully. The fossil record from the Aguja Formation and equivalent deposits gives us a snapshot of Deinosuchus population density along the Laramidian coast. Multiple individuals of varying sizes have been recovered from overlapping geographic areas, which tells us that these animals coexisted in the same river systems and coastal zones. But the bone histology data, combined with the known growth rates and the ecological carrying capacity of the environment, suggests that truly large adults, animals over 10 meters and weighing more than 5 or 6 metric tons, were probably rare. Perhaps 1 or 2 individuals per several kilometers of suitable river and delta habitat. That rarity, combined with the decades-long investment required to reach maximum size, would have made territory intensely valuable. A stretch of river with reliable access to hadrosaur crossing points, deep pools for ambush, and sufficient prey density to support an animal of this metabolic magnitude was worth defending, worth fighting for. And Deinosuchus almost certainly fought. Modern large crocodilians engage in serious, sometimes lethal combat over territory and mating rights. Male saltwater crocodiles attack each other with a ferocity that frequently results in lost limbs, torn jaws, and fatal wounds. Animals that have survived decades of growth and ecological pressure do not yield territory without a fight. And there is no reason to believe Deinosuchus was any different. Imagine 2 fully grown individuals, animals 12 meters long, weighing the better part of 8 metric tons each, meeting at a contested stretch of river delta. The initial signaling, the head slap displays, the long, slow approach, each animal reading the other's body posture, skull profile, the prominence of that nasal boss. And then, if neither yielded, the collision. The impact of 2 of the most powerfully built animals in Cretaceous North America driving into each other with the full force of their mass. Jaws built to crush hadrosaur femurs closing on the skulls and necks of their own kind. These were not gentle creatures, in any context. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Deinosuchus, the detail that, once you fully absorb it, genuinely changes how you think about the ecology of the Late Cretaceous,
is not its size or its teeth or its territorial aggression. It is its patience. Modern large crocodilians can go for extraordinarily long periods without food. A large Nile crocodile can survive for more than a year between significant meals if necessary. This is not a flaw in their biology, it is a feature. An evolved metabolic strategy that allows an ectothermic ambush predator to conserve energy during periods of low prey availability and then capitalize explosively when an opportunity presents itself. Deinosuchus, as a crocodilian, would have shared this metabolic architecture, and scaled to its size, this means something remarkable. An adult Deinosuchus did not need to hunt every day. It did not need to hunt every week. It could wait, motionless in the shallows, invisible, endlessly, perfectly patient, waiting for the moment when a hadrosaur herd approached the water, when a large ceratopsian came to drink, when something heavy and warm and full of protein made the mistake of stepping within range. And when that moment came, after hours or days or perhaps longer, it moved. With a speed and violence entirely disproportionate to its apparent stillness. This is what made Deinosuchus so effective. Not just its size, not just its bite force, but the combination of extreme physical capability with an almost incomprehensible capacity for stillness and patience. A predator that the prey animals of the Laramidian coast could never entirely account for, because it was always there, always waiting, and it was always, until the very moment of the strike, invisible. But for all its dominance, for all its physical perfection as an ambush predator, Deinosuchus did not last forever. Nothing does. And understanding how this animal eventually disappeared from the fossil record leads us into one of the most interesting ecological stories in the entire Cretaceous. Because the disappearance of Deinosuchus was not caused by an asteroid. It was not caused by a volcanic eruption or a global mass extinction event. It disappeared millions of years before the end of the Cretaceous. And the reason why, or rather, the current best hypothesis for why, involves a shift in the ecological balance of Laramidia that is subtle, slow, and in some ways more interesting than any catastrophe. The last confirmed Deinosuchus fossils date to approximately 75 million years ago, the Campanian stage of the Late Cretaceous. And then, nothing. The genus vanishes from the fossil record completely. No transitional forms, no smaller descendants carrying the lineage forward into the Maastrichtian. No gradual decline visible in the stratigraphy, just presence and then absence. For an animal this successful, this dominant, this well-adapted, this deeply embedded in a productive coastal ecosystem, that disappearance demands an explanation. And the explanation, when you begin to assemble the available evidence, turns out to involve a cast of characters that Deinosuchus almost certainly never anticipated. Because the animal that may have played the most significant role in ending the reign of the largest crocodilian that ever lived was not a rival crocodilian. It was not a marine reptile pushing inland from the seaway. It was not a climate shift or a sea level change, though both of those were happening simultaneously. It was a tyrannosaur. Not Tyrannosaurus rex. That animal would not appear for another 10 million years. But the tyrannosaur lineage was already present and already evolving rapidly during the Campanian. And the key transition that occurred in the last few million years of Deinosuchus's existence was a dramatic increase in the size and ecological dominance of large tyrannosaurids across Laramidia. During the earlier part of Deinosuchus's reign, the Campanian interval between roughly 82 and 78 million years ago, the large theropods sharing the Laramidian ecosystem were formidable but not overwhelming. Animals like Bistahevosaur and early Albertosaurines were effective predators of medium to large prey. They competed with Deinosuchus for the same hadrosaur and ceratopsian herbivores, but they were not, in the terrestrial environment, significantly larger or more capable than Deinosuchus was in the aquatic one. The ecological partition was relatively clean. Deinosuchus owned the rivers, the deltas, the coastal margins. The tyrannosaurs owned the upland forests and the open floodplains farther from the water. But around 77 to 76 million years ago, something changed. Larger, more derived tyrannosaurs began to dominate the Laramidian fossil record. Animals that were not simply bigger than their predecessors, but fundamentally more capable as predators, better binocular vision, more powerful bite forces, more efficient locomotion. The Tyrannosaur lineage was accelerating toward the extraordinary endpoint of Tyrannosaurus rex, and even the intermediate stages of that journey produced animals of remarkable capability.
And here is the critical ecological point. As tyrannosaurs grew larger and more dominant in the terrestrial environment, they began to compete directly with Deinosuchus for the same prey base. Not at the water's edge. Theropods were not going to follow Deinosuchus into deep water, but at the margins, at the crossings, at the places where hadrosaur herds moved between terrestrial feeding grounds and the river systems where Deinosuchus waded. A hadrosaur herd that learned, through predation pressure from large tyrannosaurs, to move quickly, unpredictably, and in large coordinated groups across open ground was simultaneously becoming harder for Deinosuchus to ambush at the water's edge. The behavioral adaptations that prey animals developed in response to one predator do not disappear when they enter another predator's territory. A hadrosaur moving fast and staying in the center of a large herd because of tyrannosaurs was also, incidentally, harder to pick off at a river crossing. This is not a simple story of one predator directly killing another. Ecosystems do not usually work that way. What appears to have happened is a gradual tightening of ecological space around Deinosuchus, a slow compression of the conditions that had allowed it to thrive, prey behavior shifting, competition for carcasses intensifying, possibly changes in river systems and coastal geography as sea levels fluctuated and the western interior seaway began its long, slow retreat. There is also the question of climate. The Campanian was not a period of stable, uniform warmth. There were oscillations, intervals of cooling, changes in precipitation patterns that would have affected the extent and productivity of the coastal floodplains that Deinosuchus depended upon. An animal with a 35 to 40-year growth trajectory to maximum size is extremely vulnerable to prolonged environmental instability. If recruitment rates, the survival of juveniles to reproductive age, dropped even slightly over several consecutive decades, the population of fully grown adults would have begun to thin. Slowly at first, then faster, until the critical threshold was crossed where the population could no longer sustain itself. And then, silence. 75 million years ago, the last Deinosuchus, the last individual of a lineage that had dominated North American coastal ecosystems for nearly 10 million years. Gone. What replaced it is, in its own way, fascinating. The ecological niche that Deinosuchus had occupied, the large ambush predator of the coastal river systems, did not remain empty. Nature abhors a vacuum at the top of a food chain almost as much as it abhors any other kind of vacuum. And the animals that moved into the space left by Deinosuchus were smaller, more generalist crocodilians that had coexisted alongside the giant during its reign, surviving in the ecological margins that Deinosuchus had not fully dominated. Forms like Brachychampsa, a broad-snouted mollusk-crushing crocodilian that would later survive well into the Paleocene,
filled parts of the niche. Other crocodilian lineages diversified in the absence of the competitive pressure that a dominant giant exerts on smaller relatives. The rivers and deltas of Laramidia were not left unguarded, but they were never again patrolled by anything quite like Deinosuchus. Now step back. Step all the way back from the ecological details and the competition dynamics and the bone histology data, and consider the full picture of what Deinosuchus actually was. It was a crocodilian, a member of a lineage that had already existed for tens of millions of years before Deinosuchus appeared, and that continues to exist today. It did not represent a radical evolutionary departure from the crocodilian body plan. It did not develop novel weapons or revolutionary hunting strategies. It took what crocodilians already were, ambush predators of extraordinary patience and explosive power, and scaled those qualities to a degree that the ecosystem had never seen before and has never seen since. In doing so, it became something remarkable, an animal that occupied the apex predator role not in the terrestrial environment where the dinosaurs reigned, but in the liminal space between land and water, in the margins, in the edges, in the places where the rules of the terrestrial world dissolved into something older and more dangerous. Dinosaurs that were apex predators on land, animals that nothing in the forest or the open plain would dare challenge, became prey at the water's edge. The largest hadrosaurs, the most heavily built ceratopsians, possibly even juvenile sauropods in regions where their ranges overlapped, all of them entered Deinosuchus territory with the awareness, encoded in their species through millions of years of predation pressure, that the water was not safe. That awareness is itself a form of evidence. When prey animals evolve behavioral responses to a predator, wariness near water, preference for well-lit crossing points, movement in large groups through dangerous zones, those behaviors persist and leave traces in the ecology long after the individual encounters that shape them. The fear of Deinosuchus was written into the behavioral ecology of Laramidian dinosaurs as surely as its teeth were written into their fossilized bones. And that, in many ways, is the most enduring legacy of Deinosuchus. Not the fossils in museum collections, not the scientific papers and the phylogenetic analyses and the biomechanical models, but the ghost of its influence on the animals it hunted, the invisible pressure it exerted on the behavior of every large dinosaur that lived near water in late Cretaceous North America for 10 million years. 10 million years. To put that in perspective, our own genus, Homo, has existed for approximately 2.5 million years. Deinosuchus terrorized the coastlines of Laramidia for 4 times as long as our entire genus has walked the earth. We are very new here. Deinosuchus was not. But there is one final chapter to the Deinosuchus story, one that moves from the deep past into the relatively recent present. Because the scientific history of how we came to understand this animal, the actual human story of its discovery and interpretation, is almost as dramatic as the animal itself. And it begins, appropriately enough, not with a complete skeleton or a well-preserved skull, but with teeth so strange and so massive that the first scientist to examine them had absolutely no idea what he was looking at. The year was 1858. The place was Bladen County, North Carolina, and the man holding the fossil was Ebenezer Emmons, state geologist of North Carolina, veteran of decades of fieldwork across the American Southeast, a scientist with enough experience to recognize when something genuinely unusual had come out of the ground. What Emmons had in his hands were teeth. Just teeth. No skull material, no limb bones, no vertebrae. simply a collection of enormous, thick-walled, heavily ridged fossil teeth recovered from Cretaceous-age deposits in the coastal plain sediments of North Carolina. And Emmons, to his credit, recognized immediately that they were significant. He described them formally and assigned them to a new genus, Polyptychodon, a name suggesting the complex, ridged structure of the enamel surface. But Emmons made an error, an understandable error given the material he was working with and the state of paleontological knowledge in 1858. He concluded that these teeth belonged to a marine reptile, a plesiosaur, or something like one. The thick, rugose enamel, the unusual proportions, they did not fit comfortably into any known category of crocodilian. And so they were filed, taxonomically speaking, under the wrong heading. And they stayed there for decades. The story might have remained in that state of confusion indefinitely had it not been for a discovery made 30 years later and several hundred kilometers to the southwest in the Red Rock Badlands of western North Carolina and neighboring Georgia. In the 1880s, fossil collectors working the Cretaceous deposits of the southeastern United States began recovering material that was clearly crocodilian in origin. Osteoderms, the bony armor plates that line the back of all crocodilians, of extraordinary size. Not the modest, palm-sized plates of a modern alligator, plates the size of dinner plates. Thick, heavily built, unmistakably crocodilian in their structure, but scaled to dimensions that suggested an animal far beyond anything living. These finds attracted the attention of John Bell Hatcher, one of the most gifted fossil collectors of the 19th century, a man responsible for recovering some of the most important dinosaur material ever found in North America. Hatcher recognized the significance of the large crocodilian material and brought it to the attention of the American scientific establishment. And it was in 1893 that the name Deinosuchus first appeared in the scientific literature. The material was formally described, the genus erected, and the basic recognition established. This was a very large crocodilian, something well outside the size range of any living species. The name itself came from the Greek. Dinos, terrible, suchos, crocodile. Terrible crocodile. But terrible how? How large exactly? How did it fit into the Cretaceous ecosystem? What did it eat? How did it live? These questions in 1893 remained almost entirely unanswered. The material was too fragmentary, too incomplete. A genus with a name and a handful of bones, floating in paleontological space without a clear context or a fully reconstructed identity. The next major step did not come until the 1940s, and it came through the work of a paleontologist whose name is still invoked with reverence in discussions of North American Cretaceous fauna, Roland T. Byrd. Byrd was a field collector for the American Museum of Natural History in New York. He is perhaps best known for his discovery and excavation of the famous dinosaur trackways at Glen Rose, Texas, a site that produced some of the most spectacular sauropod and theropod tracks ever found. But in the early 1940s, working in the Big Bend region of Texas, Byrd recovered something that would prove equally significant for our understanding of Deinosuchus. He found skull material. Not a complete skull. The complete skull of a Deinosuchus has never been recovered, and this remains one of the great frustrations of the field. But enough. Enough to begin reconstructing the proportions. Enough to estimate the size of the animal. Enough to understand, for the first time, the true scale of what Cretaceous North America had been home to. Byrd's material from the Aguja Formation in Texas revealed a skull that he initially estimated at around 2 meters in length. This was, if accurate, astonishing. A 2-meter skull implied a total body length of somewhere between 15 and 20 meters, numbers that placed Deinosuchus not just among the largest crocodilians that had ever lived, but potentially among the largest predatory animals in the history of the planet. Bird brought his findings back to the American Museum, where they were examined by the paleontologist Barnum Brown, another legendary figure in the history of North American paleontology, the man who had discovered the first Tyrannosaurus rex skeleton decades earlier. Brown was impressed. He wrote about the Big Bend material with barely concealed excitement, describing Deinosuchus as a creature that would have been capable of preying on the largest dinosaurs of its time. But here is where the story becomes complicated. Because the skull material Bird recovered was incomplete and partially distorted by the fossilization process, the initial size estimates were based on extrapolations from fragmentary bones, and those extrapolations, as tends to happen with fragmentary material, erred on the side of the dramatic. For the next several decades, Deinosuchus existed in the popular and scientific imagination as an almost mythologically vast creature. 15 meters, perhaps more, an animal so large it made the saltwater crocodile look trivial. Artists reconstructed it as a genuine sea monster capable of swallowing a tyrannosaur whole. Museum displays presented it in apocalyptic terms. And then the reassessments began. In the 1980s and 1990s, as new and better preserved material began to emerge from Texas and from the southeastern United States, paleontologists started applying more rigorous scaling methods to the available evidence. The skull proportions were re-examined. The relationship between skull length and total body length in crocodilians, which is not a simple linear ratio but varies considerably between species, was analyzed more carefully. The revised estimates were still extraordinary, but they were somewhat more conservative than Bird's original figures. A total length of 10 to 12 meters for the largest individuals, a body mass of 5 to 8 metric tons. Still the largest crocodilian known from North America, still one of the largest that had ever lived. But not quite the 15 to 20 meter leviathan that earlier accounts had described. This kind of scientific revision is sometimes presented in popular accounts as a deflation, a disappointment, as if the animal somehow becomes less impressive when the estimates are refined downward. But this misunderstands how science works, and it misunderstands what the revised Deinosuchus actually was. A 10 to 12 meter crocodilian weighing 8 metric tons is not a diminished version of a 20-meter monster. It is a real animal, an animal whose dimensions have been established through careful, rigorous analysis of actual physical evidence. And an animal that, at 10 to 12 meters and 8 metric tons, was still capable of everything we have discussed. The hadrosaur predation, the bone-crushing bite force, the decades-long growth trajectory, the ecological dominance of Cretaceous coastal environments. The revision made Deinosuchus more real, more credible, and in doing so, it made it more frightening, not less. Because a carefully documented, scientifically supported monster is always more unsettling than an inflated myth. The most significant modern work on Deinosuchus came in the early 2000s when David Schwimmer, a paleontologist at Columbus State University in Georgia, published a comprehensive monograph on the genus. Schwimmer had spent years collecting and analyzing Deinosuchus material from the southeastern United States, and his work synthesized the available evidence into the most complete picture of the animal that science had produced to that point. It was Schwimmer's research that firmly established the predatory behavior of Deinosuchus through the bite mark analysis we discussed earlier, and it was partly in recognition of his contributions that the eastern species was formally named Deinosuchus schwimmeri. Then came 2020, and the paper by Cossette and Brochu that fundamentally reorganized our understanding of Deinosuchus diversity. Prior to that publication, Deinosuchus had been treated primarily as a single genus with perhaps two species, one from the west of Laramidia, one from the Appalachian east.
But Cossette and Brochu's redescription, drawing on newly prepared material and applying modern phylogenetic methods that had not been available to earlier researchers, revealed that the picture was considerably more complex. 3 distinct species, different skull proportions, subtle but significant differences in tooth morphology and osteoderm structure, a geographic distribution that reflected the deep separation of the 2 Cretaceous landmasses, Laramidia and Appalachia, divided by the western interior seaway for millions of years. Species that had diverged from a common ancestor and followed their own evolutionary trajectories in relative isolation. This finding transformed Deinosuchus from a single dominant predator into something more interesting, a radiation, a group of closely related giants that had independently evolved or maintained from a common ancestor the same basic strategy of extreme large-body ambush predation in 2 separate landmasses simultaneously. And it raised a question that the 2020 paper addressed but did not fully resolve. A question about the ancestry of Deinosuchus, about where this lineage came from, about what evolutionary pathway produces an animal this large. Because Deinosuchus did not appear from nowhere. It had ancestors, smaller crocodilians from earlier Cretaceous deposits that represent the beginning of the lineage that would eventually produce the largest crocodilian North America ever saw. And tracing that lineage backward, identifying the earlier, smaller relatives that bridge the gap between ordinary-sized crocodilians and the giant, is one of the active areas of Deinosuchus research today. The family Deinosuchidae, as currently understood, includes a small number of closely related genera that share specific anatomical features linking them to the giant. Some of these relatives were themselves large animals, not Deinosuchus large, but significantly bigger than most modern crocodilians. The lineage appears to have had a persistent tendency toward large body size, a trend that reached its extreme expression in Deinosuchus itself. What drove that trend? What selective pressures pushed this lineage repeatedly and consistently toward larger and larger body size over millions of years of evolution? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. Large body size in ambush predators confers obvious advantages: the ability to take larger prey, greater resistance to injury in confrontations with large prey animals, the metabolic benefits of thermal inertia in a large-bodied ectotherm. But large body size also has costs: longer time to reproductive maturity, greater resource requirements, reduced population density, increased vulnerability to environmental instability. Something in the ecology of late Cretaceous North American coastal environments consistently favored larger and larger body size in this lineage. And working out exactly what that something was requires more fossil material, more detailed ecological reconstruction, and more sophisticated modeling than we currently have access to. Which means, in the most honest terms possible, that the story of Deinosuchus is not finished. It will not be finished for a long time. Every new specimen that comes out of the Aguja Formation or the coastal plain deposits of Georgia and Alabama adds another data point. Every new application of analytical technology, CT scanning of skull material, isotopic analysis of tooth enamel to reconstruct diet and habitat use, geometric morphometric analysis of skull shape variation, adds another layer of resolution to the picture. And somewhere out there, in the red and tan sediments of the Big Bend Badlands, or in a riverbank exposure along the Gulf coastal plain, there may be a skull. A complete skull of Deinosuchus, preserved in 3 dimensions, waiting for the erosion that will eventually bring it to the surface
and into the hands of someone who knows what they are looking at. That skull, when it is found, will answer questions that we have been asking for over 160 years. It will settle debates about the exact proportions of the rostrum. It will allow precise calculation of jaw muscle volume and bite force. It will show us in detail that no current specimen can provide exactly what the most formidable crocodilian in North American history actually looked like. Until then, we work with what we have. Fragments and teeth and partial skulls and bite-marked bones. The incomplete evidence of a vanished world, assembled with care and patience and the accumulated knowledge of generations of paleontologists who looked at strange, massive fossils in the ground and refused to stop asking questions. That is, in the end, what paleontology is. Not the discovery of complete, perfect specimens. Those are rare and precious and remarkable when they occur. Paleontology is the art of building a complete picture from incomplete evidence. Of looking at a tooth the size of your hand and seeing in it the entire animal, the ecosystem, the behavior, the millions of years of evolutionary history that produced something as extraordinary as Deinosuchus. And the picture we have built, incomplete as it remains, shows us something genuinely humbling. An animal that dominated one of the most productive and diverse ecosystems in the history of North America for 10 million years. A predator that made large dinosaurs afraid of the water. A crocodilian that achieved body dimensions no crocodilian has matched before or since. A creature of patience and explosive violence and biological perfection for its time and place. Deinosuchus is gone. It has been gone for 75 million years. Its lineage left no direct descendant. The rivers and deltas it patrolled are now desert and prairie and mountain range, transformed beyond recognition by the geological forces that have reshaped this continent dozens of times since the Campanian. But its teeth are still in the ground. Its bite marks are still in the bones of the dinosaurs it hunted. And its story, assembled piece by piece, decade by decade, from fragments and impressions and chemical traces in ancient rock, is still being told. And it is a story worth telling, because Deinosuchus reminds us of something that the modern world, with its relatively modest fauna of large predators, can make us forget. That the Earth has produced things of almost unimaginable scale and capability. That the animals alive today are not the ceiling of what life can achieve. That for most of the history of this planet, the largest and most powerful predators were not mammals, were not even warm-blooded. They were patient. They were armored. They were ancient beyond our easy comprehension. And they waited at the water's edge. If you have made it to the end of this story, if Deinosuchus has captured something in your imagination the way it has captured mine, then leave a comment below. Tell me which detail hit hardest. The bite marks in hadrosaur bone? The 35-year growth trajectory? The nasal boss and what it implies about the social life of a 10-meter crocodilian? The fact that this animal existed for 4 times as long as our entire genus has been on Earth. And if there is another creature from the deep past that you want to explore, another predator, another giant, another evolutionary mystery buried in the rock, tell me that too. Because there are more stories down there, far more than we will ever fully tell. And every one of them is worth the telling down there. Far more than we will ever fully tell. And every one of them is worth the telling.